I'm really pleased to welcome you to this talk about intersectional class struggle. I'm Jesse Cohn from the Institute for Anarchist Studies. I live in Indiana on stolen Potawatomi land, where I teach English, and am also very interested in labor history. Michael Reagan is a union activist with the American Federation of Teachers and a historian at University of Washington's Robinson Center for Young Scholars and adjunct faculty at Seattle College. His work focuses on class studies, cultural theory, and urban history. He's the author of Intersectional Class Struggle, Theory and Practice from this year. And his writing has appeared in the Boston Review, Truth Out, Counterpunch, Perspectives, and the South Seattle Emerald. Julie Greene joining us is a historian of United States transnational and global labor and immigration. She's the author of The Canal Builders, Making America's Empire at the Panama Canal, from Penguin Press in 2009, which received the Organization of American Historians James A. Rawley Prize for the best book on the history of race relations. In 2011, Greene and Ira Berlin co-founded the Center for Global Migration Studies at the University of Maryland, a center dedicated to generating knowledge of the history and politics of global migrations and US immigration. Greene's recent writing includes Rethinking the Boundaries of Class, Labor Histories and Theories of Class and Capitalism, published in the journal Labor. I think you're going to speak a little bit from some of that, the points you make in that article. Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Michael to talk about the book.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really grateful for your time and that folks are showing up for the book and this conversation with Professor Greene. Really grateful for you, Professor Greene, as well. I just sort of cold emailed you because I admired your article and your work so much, and you were very gracious to agree to do this. So I really appreciate that. To you as well, Jesse, for taking the time to host, and also to Suzanne from AK Press, who did all the work to make this happen. So I really appreciate all of you. We're here to talk a little bit about my book, Intersectional Class Struggle, which came out with AK Press earlier this year. And Professor Greene has a wonderful essay in the latest issue of the Labor History Journal that deals with really similar themes. And I'm really excited to be in conversation about that. I'll take maybe 20 minutes. And then Professor Greene will have some comments based on her article, and then we can turn it over to you all, the audience. We'll be taking questions at the very end. I believe you should see a function to type some questions. So if things occur to you, you can write those up there, and then we will address them in the final Q&A section. So let's see. You know, this might be obvious, but we live in a class-driven society. You all may have noticed this in your day-to-day experience or in whatever city you're zooming in from for this webinar. Where I am coming from, Seattle, the disparities and the inequalities around class are pretty stark. We have the two richest individuals in human history, both multi-billionaires, both white men, in a city with a homelessness crisis that is evident everywhere you go. It seems every month there are new encampments and shanty towns in neighborhoods all over the city. Wealth inequality has been expanding for the last 40 to 50 years. We live in what some people have called a second Gilded Age. If you look at the composition of homeless populations in Seattle and nationwide, the homeless are more likely to be people of color, in particular Black, Latin, and American Indian. They're more likely to be trans people and gender non-conforming people. They are more likely to be men by a factor of 2 to 1, but women are more likely to experience poverty overall, with roughly 70% of people who live under the poverty line being women and children. So I bring that up because we can see class having an impact all around us. And as we try to drill down on the factors and experience of class, even talking about something that is strictly related to class, like inequality, we begin to see the factors of race, gender, sexuality, citizenship, ability. All of these factors play a determining role in how people experience class in our society. And I'm picking just one issue around homelessness and inequality, but we can pick practically anything that we're facing in the 21st century around climate change, reproductive health and reproductive access, police brutality and police violence. Any of these issues are profoundly class issues at the same time that they're being co-defined by race, gender, and these other factors. The problem, I think, and the idea for the book came about because although we can see this happening around us all the time, the language that we have to talk about class is struggling. It's not very robust, especially in popular discourse and mainstream conversations about class, where people struggle to identify class with either education or income or some other somewhat arbitrary factors that people try to delimit what class means in American societies or Western societies. But even in left and academic circles, where class is being defined in very rigid and narrow kinds of constructions around, for example, a relationship to the means of production, most famously, or around identity or something like this. And it seems like many of these conversations about class could use some clarity, and that there was a robust tradition, I found, mostly coming from working class people themselves involved in struggle, of a different way of addressing and talking about class. And as I started to look into the question, I started to identify what I call a tradition in the book, a tradition of intersectional class struggle, that is coming simultaneously from working class people themselves as they experience class conflict and class struggle in their workplace and outside of their workplace, and also an intellectual tradition coming from scholars, activists, writers, philosophers, and others who, when we put them in conversation with each other, I think we can rightly call it a tradition of intersectional class struggle. And so there are two ways I'd like to talk about this then, and I'd like to do that by just sharing some examples and sharing some stories from working class people themselves about what they experienced and the types of conclusions they've come to. And we can almost pick at random from legacies of struggle to identify how class and race and gender all sort of co-form to make these forms of resistance possible and forms of oppression that people experience. The one that I talk about in the book is from the origins of industrial capitalism in the United States, the Lowell textile factories and the working class women who were the first industrial workforce in the 1820s, 1830s and 40s, and how their experience with both being the first waged labor workforce here in the United States and dealing with forms of patriarchal control inside and outside of the workplace began to create this synthesis of an identity and a political movement in opposition to both patriarchal control and capitalism. And I think one of the more interesting things about the struggle, if we're thinking about it structurally, is to ask the question, why was it that early industrialists were hiring almost exclusively women in the early 19th century? Why was the first industrial workforce composed of working class women? And why is that almost universally true, even to this day, as countries industrialize? The first wave of industrialization is routinely textile production. It's almost always employing, if not exclusively, predominantly women and children laborers. Why does that continue to happen? And as I was thinking about it, one of the most obvious answers, true for capitalism in that era and our own, is that employers were looking for cheap labor. They were looking to maximize their profits. They wanted to keep wages down as far as they possibly could, and women workers could be paid less. And so they relied predominantly on women to fill those roles. But I think if we stop and are satisfied with just that answer, it's not very satisfactory. We have to ask a further question, which is, why is women's labor so cheap? Why was it able to be sold for less? And we have to ask a further question that I think has two components to it, one material and one cultural. So on the material side, women's labor is being sold for less in the early 19th century because of factors of supply and demand, strictly economic questions. There's an abundance of women workers and women who are looking for paid employment. They create a large labor pool that employers can draw on and pay, which depresses the wages, and so therefore pay them less. So on one hand, this is a strictly material question. But if we interrogate that a little bit more, women are a large labor pool because their access in society to other forms of paid employment is being restricted by cultural standards, what historians have called the cult of domesticity in the early 19th century. That is the idea that women's natural and most fit role is for domestic concerns around care, moral questions, and things of this nature. Therefore, women couldn't, they couldn't pursue professional employment like law or medicine. They couldn't work in other types of paid employment outside the home. They couldn't own property or even speak in public around political questions. So there were cultural restrictions that were preventing access to greater forms of social engagement and social and society. And those had very dramatic material impacts on women's scope of opportunities and led to this pool of women's labor that could be used for the early industrialization. So just in that one very quick example, we can see both material and cultural forms kind of co-constructing this moment in which women find themselves exploited as the first waged workforce and also oppressed because of their gender status in society overall. But more than this, and the thing that's really interesting about the Lowell factory workers is that they resisted, and they were very specific and eloquent in the ways that they resisted. They were working 12 to 14-hour days. They were facing very dangerous conditions with hundreds of workers being killed and injured in the factories in these decades. And they began to articulate a synthesis between these mutual forms of reinforcing oppression that they found. When they tried to speak out about their dangerous working conditions, they were often condemned. They were ridiculed for giving public speeches or trying to circulate petitions to change the working conditions that they found themselves in. And they sort of recognized that synthesis and started articulating it. There's one worker in particular who comes up in the book, Sarah Bagley, who writes this scathing editorial in the 1840s. A co-worker of hers fired for trying to organize on the job. And the overseer who fires her has disparaging comments about this person's womanhood while he's firing her. And Bagley writes just this, she just excoriates this overseer. She promises to destroy his name in perpetuity and hound him for the injustice of his actions. But one of the things that she writes in that editorial is that, you know, the working women recognize these intersections. They see themselves being exploited on the job. They see their social condition as an oppressed gender, as contributing to that greater social vulnerability. And she vows to struggle against it in perpetuity. She says, let me see if I can find the quote. She argues that for working class women such as herself, that our name is legion, though our oppression be great. We war with oppression in every form, she writes, with rank save that which merit gives. And that is a very quick distillation of a concept of intersectional class struggle, that is, we war with oppression in every form, that we can see in working class struggle scattered throughout history in the era of industrial capitalism and after. And I think what stories like the Lowell Mill Girls show us, and the other types of intersectional class struggle of this type show us, is that we need to take both material and cultural forms of social power into account in our scholarship and in our activism and organizing, that these things are not in any way separate, but in fact are co-formed, co-determinative. There's no single ultimate determination here, but these things are influencing each other in a historical process. And that because of that, it opens up the field of social struggle and activism and scholarship to forms outside just workplace or strictly economic questions, but to the everyday lived experiences that working class people have inside and outside of the workplace, in the home, in neighborhoods, in communities, in other forms of social organization. So I think it's a really worthwhile and important lesson that we can learn from the voices of working people themselves. And the book goes into other examples of folks who have been articulating similar ideas. The other part of the book is more focused on theory and chronicles the evolution, sort of an intellectual theory that chronicles the evolution of thought from 18th century Enlightenment liberal thinkers through 19th century socialist or early forms of socialist thinkers like Proudhon and Marx, into 20th century notions of intersections between initially race and capitalism, or race and class, and kind of siloed, but happening simultaneously, gender and class, before I think we get to the late 20th century and people articulating this kind of intersectional analysis that can bring all three of those things in conversation. And I think the reason why it's important to highlight that intellectual tradition is because there are things to draw from all of those thinkers. And once we kind of put them in conversation, we can get a far more robust understanding. So in particular, thinking about early 19th century anti-capitalist thought coming from Proudhon and Marx, there are some core insights there that are really worthwhile. Notions of class struggle in particular, critiques of property as holding the source of social antagonism, property itself as being inherently exclusionary, that creates the ability to, by some people, to exploit others. These are ideas, again, that are not just coming from the big names that many of us are familiar with, but also from working class people themselves who began to articulate similar ideas. E.P. Thompson's work on the early English working class, he's trying to demonstrate something similar, that workers are coming to a broadly what we could call socialist or anti-capitalist consciousness of social antagonism. It's happening in the United States at roughly the same time too. Here, the example of William Silvis, who was an iron worker and early union organizer, also began to articulate these notions of social antagonism, what he called an inevitable and irresistible conflict at the core of emerging capitalist society, what he called never-ending antagonism, what I call in the book a permanent antagonism around this conflict over property and profit. Those thinkers and those ideas provide a really important material foundation for class studies and class struggle. They're looking at strictly economic factors, and those insights are very useful. But very quickly in the 20th century, thinkers began to see that as somewhat limiting and see struggle as expanding into the field of consciousness and culture and experience. And here, people like Gramsci, the English historian E.P. Thompson, anarchist thinkers like Rudolf Rocker, all began to emphasize culture and consciousness as being as important, as determinative around class positions and class struggle as the materialist view. Those insights were happening at the same time that others, like W.E.B. Du Bois, were writing about the intersections of class struggle and race struggle in the United States. And while these conversations were somewhat siloed, they begin to have a cumulative impact. Du Bois, for example, writing about, in his book, Black Reconstruction, writing about the condition of enslaved peoples in the Americas as being part around white supremacy and creating a racial hierarchy, and also about labor exploitation and the emergence of capitalism, and emphasizing the role of labor in particular as a potentially emancipatory, in the case of American enslaved people's self-emancipatory process in what he calls the general strike of slaves in during the Civil War. So by the time we get to the post-60s period of social thinkers, we have a much clearer articulation of what became known as intersectionality. This is coming from these earlier insights and emphasizing culture as well as materiality, and mostly from feminist activists and scholars in the 70s and 80s. In particular, I just want to draw, I'll try to wrap this up very quick and we can move to questions. I just want to draw on two concepts that are coming from Black feminist thought that proved very important for my book as it developed. One is the concept of intersectionality itself, which was being deployed as a metaphor. I think it's very important to say, to think about how power relates and reinforces one another. Forms of racial power can reinforce class hierarchies and class divisions, how class as a social force is mediated through experiences of race and gender, sexuality, and these other things. And they use intersectionality as a metaphor to talk about that co-constructedness, what I try to call in the book social totality, drawing on Marx and other thinkers. And the other idea that proved really important for the book is one around difference and diversity that comes out of Black feminist thought. In particular, Patricia Hill Collins writes about this in her book from the 1980s called Black Feminist Thought, where she talks about the experience of Black women as not being reduced to a singular identity or a singular experience. That in fact, in that social position, there's a collectivity, and in conversation and in social struggle, there are different conclusions, different experiences, different ideas that people draw from within that same shared social subject position. That's a very, very useful idea to think about in relation to class studies and definitions of working class peoples at the same time. There is, in fact, no singular universal working class identity or sets of ideas or even political goals and political projects, but instead a whole diversity of peoples and struggles who experience class oppression and class exploitation differently. And as we, we're a good section of the way through the 21st century at this point, it's our task to learn to swim in these waters in a sophisticated way, to learn to work across those forms of difference by building real forms of solidarity that recognizes those differences and takes them seriously and learns to identify a shared kind of human and working class project within those. So I believe it's our task to kind of take up that challenge, and it has proved to be rather difficult. But I'm hopeful in the coming period we can learn to struggle better against these forces. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's a difficult book to compress. It's such a wealth of detail. Dr. Greene, can you add to our picture?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for helping us do this, Jesse, and thank you, Professor Reagan, for inviting me to participate. And thanks to AK Press for setting it up as well. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you all for being here with us. I'm happy to be here in a sense, exploring, but also celebrating the publication of Professor Reagan's book. It's just really a fantastic book. And I admire the way that it speaks to the moment we're in right now. It's really great at storytelling and at presenting really complex theoretical ideas in a way that relates to the struggles we're all living in right now, but also with the historical context. So I admire that very much. Michael approached me. I hadn't known about his book being in press, but I had published this article in Labor Studies in Working Class History. And it turns out that he and I were thinking along very similar lines for the most part. My only wish was that I could have read his book before I wrote my article, because he goes into a lot more detail on a lot of issues. So I am really committed to the idea that we need to be thinking in more complex ways about class and about the character of capitalism, generally speaking, and about, really, as Michael put it just now, about the ways in which different spheres are co-formed. And so that class is there, but it is manifesting itself in so many different ways. It's so connected to race, to gender, to disability, to imperialism and colonialism, to nationalism, so that when we think about the capaciousness of capitalism and the interconnectedness of these different historical dynamics, I think we begin to get a better understanding of class itself, as well as those other identities. So I thought I'd just say a little bit, and maybe it kind of helps tee up some of our later conversation about some of the theoretical points I was making in that essay in Labor. When I wrote that essay, my audience was really labor historians, and I was wanting in particular to urge labor historians to think more, to explore more carefully what we mean by class and how it works. It seemed to me that in the work they had been doing for decades, labor and working class historians had been profoundly shaped by the ideas happening in African American studies, in ethnic studies, in gender studies. But nonetheless, when asked how exactly does class work, they still relied upon somewhat narrow conceptualizations. I was talking about some of, as my ideas were forming, I was talking a bunch with Alice Kessler Harris, and she directed me to her classic 1990 essay, A New Agenda for Labor History, in which she argued that scholars had turned towards culture in the 1980s and 1990s as a way of transcending some of the limitations of more traditional notions, Marxist or even E.P. Thompsonian notions of class. And she argued that at that moment, she felt that the field of scholars had sort of evaded class. And she really reinforced my thinking that more careful conceptualizations were needed. So my article argued for rethinking class to focus more on the complicated ways that capitalism generates class relationships, in part by embedding race, gender, and other historical dynamics within its formative parameters. My article focused in particular on two theoretical traditions that I found especially useful, one being social reproduction theory, which a lot of scholars have contributed to, but the scholar I was focusing on was in particular Titi Bhattacharya. And then also, secondly, the work of Stuart Hall, which Professor Reagan talks about quite a bit in his book. And so I'll say just a couple of things about each of those. Social reproduction theory focuses on an insight in traditional Marxism that the key to capitalism is labor power, but points out that this labor power itself is produced not just at the workplace, but throughout the family household. And so that approach immediately kind of broadens our understanding of who is the global working class by presenting it in a much more multi-ethnic and multi-gendered subjectivity. It kind of begins to help us think about capitalism itself as grounded in and centered around the family and the household as much, if not more, than the traditional workplace. It becomes women's labor within the household that is central to capitalism's ability to accumulate wealth. So right away, it takes us to a larger landscape than just the work site. Stuart Hall, there's just so much that is useful in his writings, I think, for both activists and scholars. At his heart, he's like social reproduction theory. He's really trying to expand upon Marx's notion of the economic, quote unquote, to think much more capaciously about a totality that's composed of also the social, the ideological, the political realms. And he looks a lot at the ways in which capitalism thrives by creating distinct social formations in which classes are themselves heterogeneous and divided by factions and by tensions and by conflicting interests. He focuses a lot on the role of race in all of that, in the ways in which race is a dominant force in articulating class relations for white as well as Black workers. Talks about the ways in which class becomes experienced as race, so that race, in his famous statement, race becomes, quote, the modality in which class is lived, the medium through which class relations are experienced, the form in which it is appropriated and fought through. This, he points out, has consequences for the entire class, not just for Black workers. It shapes how white workers experience their day-to-day struggles as well. And I think that, to me, is really crucial and really applicable to other relationships, that notion that class is experienced through other modalities. So in addition to race, which Hall focuses on, I think we can think about that in terms of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, imperialism, nationality, that these different historical dynamics are so interwoven that class is experienced through all of them, and they are all experienced through class as well. My own work has dealt a lot with the ways in which class is experienced through the modality of imperialism, for example. So I think between these two theories, the two really key points I see is, one is that capitalism is generating hierarchies within classes, and that class itself takes a lot of different forms as both identity experience. And so for me, this means that even as we're, identifying as labor historians, we need to be thinking well beyond any kind of traditional notion of who is a worker. We need to be thinking about working people wherever they are, whatever they believe, however they act, not limiting ourselves to radical workers or workers involved in the labor movement, although those are super important, of course, as sites of conflict with employers, but also thinking about what workers are doing at other times, that when they're struggling over childcare, when they're protesting the occupation of their country by a foreign power, or when they're attending a Trump rally. All of those things are as much sites for exploration by labor historians as any others. So I think when we look at theories like this, it helps us think about a way to reconceptualize the character and function of capitalism, as well as class relations itself. These approaches really conceptualize capitalism as a totality, as irreducible to the purely economic, or certainly irreducible to means of production, but composed also co-formed, as Professor Reagan put it, through the social, cultural, ideological, and political realms. And therefore, class itself is experienced through all of these realms, and class is being shaped by everybody, right? Class isn't just something that workers feel. Class is being expressed culturally and ideologically by the employing class as well, by Fox News. They're all expressing understandings of class, and workers in different social formations may be swayed by those understandings of class more than what the industrial workers of the world is expressing at any given moment. When we think about class this way, we see it as profoundly connected to household and family relations. We see it articulated via different racial, gender, ethnic relations. In other words, how workers experience their class is shaped by different sources. When your foreman is shouting at you and you're dealing with that because you didn't keep up with the assembly line, that's certainly producing a class experience. But listening to Tucker Carlson go on about replacement is also generating, for better or worse, some kind of a class experience as well. So in this way of looking at it, class is a highly complicated and fluid power relationship that takes different forms, that changes historically, and can take distinct forms for different people in diverse regions and settings. All of this is to say, mostly you should get yourself a copy of Michael Reagan's book, because he goes into a lot of these things in a lot more detail. And now I think, as Michael said, there's the little Q&A thing at the bottom there. If you have questions or comments on any of this. Thank you.
Yes, please don't be shy. So if you click the Q&A button, you'll be able to type in questions, and then we can field those. I was wondering if I was also really interested in the way that Stuart Hall figured into your talk about this new formulation of class theory, and especially his concept of articulation, right? This process of forming a class culture. It seems to me that the real cunning of the right wing in the U.S. in my lifetime has been to articulate working class identity to whiteness and to conservatism. That's a tough problem to overcome. How can we re-articulate working class identity with radical and revolutionary politics?
That is the $64,000 question. I wish I knew the answer to that question very easily. I mean, I think what I like about what Stuart Hall is doing, and Professor Greene was just articulating that very nicely, is open up multiple aspects of society as fields of social struggle. So class struggle is not something that's happening strictly in the workplace and around wages, or even like social wages, like nationalized healthcare and things of that sort, but around all kinds of questions around identity, perspective, culture, preferences. Professor Greene, what you write about in your article around common sense, opening up the field of common sense itself as a field of struggle. And the example you give is Samuel Gomper's writing in, is it the late 19th century, about expanding US empire and attempting to keep out, foreigners to grade American labor standards as a common sense proposal to keep American wages up. That common senseness is something that needs to be struggled against to build an international and intersectional struggle. So, your question is how we do that. I don't know. I hate to give you the hard part of this question, Professor, but it's an important one for sure.
Right. Yeah, I think, I like your returning to the Gramscian thinking about common sense, because I think that's really important here. The ways in which ideology takes so many different forms, and common sense, if we see it as just the accumulation of popular knowledge at any given time, will include just a mix of so many different kinds of ideas. And those ideas are then also shaped in turn by the broader material power relations. And as popular beliefs become hegemonic, as Gramsci would talk about, they basically start to function as a material force. So, that takes us again back to thinking about how working people's consciousness is being shaped by many different forces. And so how we deal with that and how we create a radical or revolutionary politics is we need tools at every level, right? We need ideological tools. We need to be forming ideas of popular knowledge through newspapers, through radio, through podcasts, through talking to one another and organizing. It has to be happening at many different levels at once.
I think the emphasis on popular is really important. I think both scholarly circles that I'm in and activist circles that I'm in are something got lost. There's less of a concern around popular and mass information and mass struggle, and one question to the how is we need a recommitment to that, to talking to people across difference, people that we might not agree with initially, and figuring out ways to have conversations and move people.
Let's see, we have a few questions queuing up in the Q&A. Samuel Brown says you've got a very fascinating insight into the subject area, and asks where do we see this broad analysis of class, looking at informal workers, day laborers, sex workers, street vendors, etc. How do we see this stepping into a broader class movement, a more inclusive movement, especially considering the death of labor unions or the declining influence of labor unions?
Yeah. Do you want to go first on that one? That's a great question.
Well, I would say what we see happening in the broader labor movement has been really exciting. We see a lot of creativity around not just using the union movement, since as Samuel Brown is saying, it has real problems. And so we've seen this really burst of creativity by workers. We see worker centers, we see even unions using new kinds of strategies that kind of fly under the radar of official labor law. We see organizations that represent street vendors or day laborers or taxi drivers or restaurant workers that are trying to organize in new ways without having to rely on what's become a really rusty and unwieldy infrastructure of the NLRB, NLRA. So to me, those kinds of things give me great hope. The other thing is that we've seen so much action around anti-racism, efforts to take down Confederate statues, which again, when we think about class being experienced in this more capacious way, we realize how all of those struggles are also related to the fundamental class struggle around us.
I 100% agree with that. And I mean, the Black Lives Matter uprising of last year, unprecedented in US history, drawing whole new sectors of working class people into struggle around issues that have very immediate concern for us. I think that's a wonderful example. But also, just thinking about your work, Professor Greene, around internationalism, I think the other place for hope is looking at international struggles in the last decade. And for example, just this year, Colombia had a national general strike that was months long around opposition to increased taxes on working people and imposed costs of the COVID crisis on regular Colombians. Whole segments of Colombian society, unions were a part, but so too were indigenous movements, teachers and students. Whole new segments of class composition were sort of coming together politically and articulating new sets of ideas around resistance and opposition. And I think in the last decade, whether it's the Chilean feminist movement that has led to a rewriting of the Constitution, or now that we're at the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring and the Tahrir Square oppositions that had both a strong worker component and student component, those are moments where we can see these different segments of working class people who have different relationships to work and labor and production, unemployed people, homemakers, flexing forms of political power that have been very dramatic and important.
Indeed, yeah. We have a question from Debbie Goldman. Does your framework reduce oppression based on race or gender to a function of capitalism alone?
Yeah, I think that's actually the very important question, because when we talk about capitalism or class, we're still sort of relating everything through class. We're saying like, oh, it's about class in these ways. And I do think that that's part of the problem. And activists and scholars are only beginning to grasp at the language that can help us think about these things. And one of the things that struck me from Professor Greene's article is that she was using the language of totality and social totality. Marx used it a little bit, the social reproduction theorists are using it, but that type of notion, and it's been called different things, other scholars called it complementary holism in an earlier period. I think intersectionality is starting to get at these ideas, but whatever we call it, focusing on that conceptual frame of a social totality, how these things relate to each other, not prioritizing one or the other, but understanding how they're co-formed, I think is very, very important. So I think that's the right question. And it's therefore up to us to develop that language. What do you think that language should be? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, a non-reductive way of talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Greene, did you want to add to that?
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think, there's kind of two things we're talking about at the same time. One is about, do we reduce it all to class? And I think definitely not. I think all of these historical dynamics are incredibly important. But Dr. Goldman's question was, is it all about capitalism? And I mean, capitalism is pretty hard to evade in 19th and 20th and 21st century United States and globally as well. So do I think there are forms of oppression beyond capitalism or before capitalism or after capitalism? I do think so, but I think the world that I'm trying to describe, capitalism, is extremely important. I just think that it sort of like Cedric Robinson talks about with racial capitalism, I think that class and race, or we could also talk about class and gender and sexuality, are co-formed, as Professor Reagan put it earlier, within capitalism. So I think it's hard to evade the power of capitalism. But I think you can talk about capitalism without privileging class as the most important dynamic.
Thank you. Lynn Serrata is asking, what are your thoughts about the relationship between the nonprofit industrial complex and organized class struggle?
What a great question. I mean, I think and building off on the previous question too, I do think talking about working class politics remains important because we continue to live under capitalist societies, and until those start to change in a fundamental way, the working class in this maybe broader definition is still going to play a really important role. And many of the institutions that we look at within that capitalist totality play an ameliorative role, but structurally one that continues to support this type of inequality that we experience. So for me, I'm a very long time and proud union member. I'm currently a member of the AFT. But man, unions are not cutting it. They are not addressing the types of struggle that we face today, and that's partially because of their institutional recognition that makes it very hard to engage in the type of class struggle that the working class women of Lowell did, opposed to oppression of every form, or enslaved workers, as Du Bois talks about them, did in struggling against the totality of these emerging forms of exploitation. So we need to find out methods and institutions of struggle that can support that kind of resistance. And it is rare for nonprofits to play that role, for sure.
All right, thank you. So somebody with the email address gardnerfair@yahoo.com Says this is a great discussion, and asks how might a discussion of capitalism's neoliberal phase and afterwards, its BS jobs, its mind-blowing financial side, its monetization of everyday experience, including social networks, etc., to the degree any of this is new and different from past phases, how might that tie into how we experience class in new intersectionalized ways?
What a great question. I don't know. I was just reading some research on youth critical consciousness development in the pandemic and the role that social media is playing in youth radicalization in all directions. So youth activists around Black Lives Matter being able to share, in meme formed or very shorthand form, very complex forms of social theory around intersectionality and colonial oppression and other things that, had electrifying and very radicalizing effects on young people in the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprising and their experience of COVID on lockdown, not in schools, educating themselves through social media networks and things like this. So, on one hand, that's very positive. I think on the other hand, that's happening to the right as well. And that in many ways, it seems that the right, at least in mainstream culture, is in fact winning these kinds of culture wars. So how we take the strength of social media as a tool of self-education and self-emancipation, and point it in really liberatory rather than authoritarian directions. Oof, that's a tough one. We got to work at it. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's well put. I think, the neoliberal moment that we're living through, with its cutting of social benefits and putting resources instead into controlling and disciplining and incarcerating, I think has certainly reshaped class experience. And, one way to think about what it's done is to think about the ways in which it's focused, the right has focused so much attention on immigrants as the scapegoat, that as wages have stagnated, minimum wage hasn't gone up significantly for decades, social benefits have been cut, working people are really struggling, they're really in hard times. And so the greater emphasis on immigrants as the scapegoat and the use of, really horrific, cruel means of managing the border, bringing the terror of the border into the interior with raids and detention and deportation. And all of that, again, it gets at what Stuart Hall talked about creating hierarchies and divisions. The great hierarchy at the heart of the immigration struggle, it's fundamentally of importance to working class people, because what it does is it erases class experience by saying the real division that should matter to you is that anytime an immigrant is able to enter the United States without documents, they're taking something away from you, the citizen. And so it's pitting the undocumented immigrant against the citizen, and using that to justify these unbelievably inhumane tactics at the border, and using that to make working class people in the interior who are struggling so much under the neoliberal state, using that to make them feel better about their lives that involve so much struggle. So I think that I think that's your question gets at a big part of how the right has been able to take such command over, we talked earlier about sort of popular knowledge about class experience. One way they've taken so much command over that has been the way they've focused attention on immigrants as the problem. And if we can just get rid of that problem, everything else will be okay, when of course we know it won't be okay.
Well said. We have a queue of questions cropping up. Hannah Forsyth says, thanks for such a terrific paper. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I have been interested in the ways that histories, legacies, and afterlives of slavery, and especially on my side of the Pacific in Australia, settler colonial studies have helped us to see the ways race and class have been historically and structurally entangled. How do you think these historical structures interact with your argument about intersectionality?
That's a wonderful question, and it's discussed in the book a little bit, but it's mostly drawing on the work of the emerging field of histories of capitalism, which has really focused on the role of slavery as a, origination point of contemporary capitalism, both in terms of creating forms of wealth that have gone on to feed exactly what the last question was talking about, finance, capital, and investment in the Western tradition, but also in creating structures of white supremacy that working class people inherited coming out of the end of slavery that have had obviously lasting impacts and keep working class people divided. So that's not really my work, but there is a summary of the literature in there, and some really excellent works, some of which have flown under the radar. Just to flag a few, I think Caitlin Rosenthal's book, Accounting for Slavery, is one of the better that I've read in terms of thinking about how just the labor practices of slave masters prefaced what industrial capitalism was doing around productivity management in the later part of the 19th century. So a lot of very, very interesting work on that I would recommend. On the question of settler colonialism, that, that's something that perhaps Professor Greene has a better take on in terms of relationships to empire and forms of expansion. There is some really interesting work. There's a book called Red Skin, White Masks by Coulthard, I want to say. Really excellent book thinking about indigenous struggle and identity, and how capitalism emerging in the 19th century is forcing forms of displacement and expansion, and therefore anti-colonial struggle is also in relationship to forms of American capitalism. But I'm less familiar with that set of literature. Yeah, but it's very promising, and I think it's growing right now.
Yeah, I would just add that I just think we need to rethink the whole history of class with more attention to the legacies of both slavery and settler colonialism. And, to connect that, I think it's hard, increasingly becoming clear that it's hard to really tell the labor history of this country without much more attention to both of those. And of course, a lot of work's been done on the connections between the white working class in the 19th century and slavery, with David Roediger's Wages of Whiteness and others influenced by him. But settler colonialism has not really been fully grappled with in terms of how it set stages over and over again for the ways that class was experienced. And then especially when we put that in dialogue with immigration and, the ways Herbert Gutman talked about, that the American working class was never made. It was made and remade over again by different stages of immigration. If we put his insight together with how we think about settler colonialism and enslavement and emancipation, I think we'll be getting to some really important insights into the class experience of this country.
I just couldn't agree more. And I think, again, we can see it in contemporary movements like happening right in front of our eyes. And the theory is just like way behind what's happening. So if we look at indigenous struggles in Canada against climate change and pipeline expansion, that just led to a national uprising just last year in Canada that shut down the entire railroad system and was drawing on different elements of working class peoples across the country. Like, there are very clearly intersections that are happening here And I know there are some younger scholars that are really taking that seriously and doing some promising work on it. But I similarly feel like we're behind on that.
I'll second, by the way, the recommendation of Glenn Coldhard's book, Red Skin, White Masks, incredibly sharp stuff. We have about five other questions in the field at the moment. Ben Sorensen asks, would not the methodology of taking on capitalism be found in solidarity unionism of the IWW? Of course, the IWW has its internal problems, but if we were to take the preamble of the OBU as it was written, the One Big Union, does the preamble give a good vision to address the wage system, class system, and racial castes of America? Or does it have inherent shortcomings that trade unionism better addresses?
Well, I love the IWW. I'm in fact a member of the IWW, and I considered using the preamble around the employing class and the working class have nothing in common as part of this talk tonight, but didn't. And so I think, yeah, very much a very important role to play. Worker struggles within workplaces are going to continue to be very important. Those are particular sites of power. When we talk about confronting these abstract things like capitalism, you know, there's real power in people's labor to begin to push back against forms of oppression and exploitation within the workplace. So I think all of that is true and important. And I think part of what my book is trying to do is show that that is one form of class struggle that is not universally true for all working class people. There are working class people that are unemployed, are homemakers, face disability, whatever it is. And so there are going to be sites of struggle for those people as well. That is important. And so as part of a kind of cornucopia of struggle, yes, I think we need to support the IWW and other workplace struggles, but as one piece.
Thank you. Let's see, Deborah Cohen chimes in to say this has been a great discussion. I'd like to see one or both of you address ways to think I guess how workers are rejecting the dynamics and relationships of work at this moment. What does this help us understand about the contemporary cracks and fissions?
Yeah, you know, Lane Wyndham recently, I think around Labor Day, had a really great essay. Maybe it was published in The Hill, where she talked about basically a general strike happening in the US at this moment. Workers just quitting or refusing to work. And you see it hitting certain sectors in especially great numbers. Others have talked about it as the Great Resignation. So I think, Professor Cohen, you're putting your fingers on something really important that I'm always an optimist. I would like to think that maybe this, what Lane Wyndham called a general strike happening before our eyes, will maybe lead to new strategies at the grassroots, fighting for better conditions, higher minimum wage, etc. If we think about that in connection to the incredible mobilizations that have been happening in among teachers in the last few years, you know, I think in 2019 we saw more strikes than had existed in this country since 1986, I think, and most of that was teacher strikes, and the ways in which teacher strikes were able to connect their demands to the needs of the students and their families. The whole concept of bargaining for the common good has been so exciting to see the radicalism and the energy coming from that. Oh, I see the next question. I just saw in the Q&A that Joseph McCartan is raising the bargaining for the common good. So I think, in short, that we see a lot happening on the ground that could lead to some really creative new strategies.
I agree. We need to disagree more, Professor. We should pick a fight on something.
Come on. You're muted, Jesse.
Sorry, we're having no trouble uniting the working class here, at least. Joseph McCartan says some AFT and NEA locals, for instance, Chicago, LA, St. Paul, have been engaging in a strategy called bargaining for the common good in recent years, which involves bringing workers and community allies together in struggles to address racism, housing, and other big and intersectional issues. Have you followed that? And do you have any thoughts about that strategy as a creative response to the intersectionality of class in the 21st century? You may have spoken to this enough already, but if you want to brighter a little bit, you're welcome to.
Professor Reagan might have more to say, but I would just say that I guess great minds think alike, Professor McCartan, because you and I are thinking the same way. That I think I see great hope in the strategies of the folks involved in bargaining for the common good.
Yeah, it's great. I was able to march with the Chicago teachers in 2017 when they were demanding an income tax for the city's richest to fund the public schools, and more of that, please.
Indeed. E.T. Mans says, I've been thinking about the gap between the way we can view and discuss these issues in academia versus in practice. My first realization about this was that as a queer / neurodivergent person, hearing people in college environments like mine discuss my communities like specimens in a petri dish instead of as people. I think a strong remedy for that is diversifying the voices in the conversation, but I see that as especially difficult in the case of poor and homeless people. Thoughts on closing that gap?
I mean, that's one of our biggest challenges, I think, is to work across difference and to build the meaningful connections that empower and enrich all of us while we have forces trying to divide us and keep us apart. So that is 100% the most important question that we face as organizers. And yeah, academics are guilty of it as well, having academic conversations, very interesting, siloed from struggle, but so too are activists who are having conversations siloed from other forms of social struggle and growth. So yes, and especially with questions of ability and regarding homeless struggle, I agree 100%. That's a great question.
I think for me, again, I mentioned this at the beginning of my comments today. Your question raises one of the things that I think is really remarkable about Professor Reagan's book is the ways in which he's talking to academics, but also to activists and people working in the field at the same time. And we don't always manage to do that as activists. I would also say I find hope in the people who engage more broadly with labor studies. There are centers around the country where people are, connecting historians to archivists, to activists, to labor movement people, and that it doesn't do everything you're wanting to see happen, but it does start to break down some of those academic walls and barriers in a way that can be very invigorating intellectually and can help our ideas have much more of a real world application.
I must say, I appreciate that about your article too, because you closed with sort of an in-house assessment of class struggle in the universities around adjunct instructors like myself and what forms of class struggle can take there. So yes, we need to keep doing that.
Yeah, labor historians really need to be thinking, for example, about their own houses, about the crisis in higher education and the adjunctification of labor. It was interesting when I was first drafting that essay, I got a lot of pushback from people. I presented the article at a seminar and people were like saying, well, you talk about theory, but then you talk about contingent scholars and how tenured people need to unite more with those facing contingency. And that's really a different issue, and you should get rid of that. And I on the advice of some friends and colleagues, I just kind of decided to be stubborn and kept it in there. And I think especially as the pandemic has hit and the crisis in higher ed has gotten worse, I've found that part of the essay has hit a nerve with people, and I'm really glad I didn't pay attention to the advice I was getting.
Yes, I would add also that as I'm thinking about that question, organizations like the IAS are filling in kind of a gap there, and trying to create that sort of popular research that I think maybe you're calling for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really relieved that Tariq Khan asks the question that I've been wondering about myself all evening, which is who's that in the portrait behind you, Michael?
Let's see. It's Lucy Parsons from a folk artist.
Nice.
Lovely. Richard Rodriguez asks, does the content of your book discuss class consciousness and intersectionality in terms of how people's perceptions are being shaped under the system of capitalism? Also, how the working class is being exploited from personal experience, and how they can understand the way the system works, especially in periods of crises, especially during the pandemic, and how people can fight back through robust labor movements and through working class education. There's a lot in there.
That is, yeah, it's trying to do that. And I think the thing that I try to articulate is to show that working class people themselves are coming to these conclusions and understandings through struggle. And it's by listening and learning to those struggles that we get better conceptual maps of the world that we live in, and two, how to organize to fight these forms of injustice that we're facing. So there's a lot to learn, and we're way behind. Movements are, continually pushing the boundaries of understanding, I think. So yes, we need to pay attention there.
Thank you. Deborah Cohen offers a follow-up that her representative Cori Bush is bringing the unhoused struggle to the fore. Ben Sorensen asks how we can commission Lucy Parsons for our own offices. I'm trying to think. I'm almost certain that I know the artist who created that, but I may be mistaken. Do you remember the artist's name?
This artist?
Yeah.
No, I don't.
That's
unfortunately.
Samuel Brown comes back with a final question. I know that in writing your book, you drew on various influences, especially a lot of Black feminist scholars. Did David Graeber influence you in any way during the course of writing the book by any chance?
Yeah, absolutely. His work on direct action, and then also his work on markets and debt. But in particular, conceptually, the way he talks about culture and its mediating impact on material factors like debt, and the way these things are historically changing, is very influential. There's a lot of work from anthropologists and cultural historians that are doing, I think, some really breakthrough stuff. Stuart Hall is just one, but French anthropologist and theorist Pierre Bourdieu is another, and Graeber, I think, is right up there with all of them, who's like methodologically, I thought was doing great.
That's interesting. I know Bourdieu is kind of a touchy subject in some circles. Some people really see him as an ally, and others are more iffy.
Yeah.
But you like Bourdieu?
Yes, I do. I found him very useful. very, a French theorist, so there's a lot of jargon. And unpacking the term habitus was like a months-long project for me, but I still appreciate his work.
I was also thinking about, I like the constellation of thinkers and concepts that you assemble in the book, from Voltairine de Cleyre to Stuart Hall. And I was wondering if there were others that you thought about including but left out ultimately. I was in particular, I kept waiting for the Midnight Notes Collective to show up somewhere. It seemed like they might fit in, especially with their idea of the working classes constantly changing in its composition.
Right. Yeah, there were too many. I mean, just an infinite number of people I wanted to bring in, and Kunant and Midnight Notes was one. Kambahi River Collective, which is in there, but gets very short attention. Gramsci really deserves to be in there more really fundamental thinker around culture and isn't. Yeah, there was always too much.
Yeah, I think actually that's one of the strengths of the books is its compactness. It makes it especially accessible, and I really like. I could imagine using this in class pretty easily.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I thought it was very compact, and then I read Julie Greene's article. I'm like, that's the better version in shorter form. How did you do that? So yeah.
Your book would be a great one to teach, both because you're very economical in your discussion of theory, but also the chapters you have where you really grounded in history and lived experience is very effective.
Yeah, thanks. And it's funny because it partially came out of teaching labor studies classes. I was like, how am I going to explain class how does this make any sense? And so having to think through that on that level was very helpful.
Yeah, it makes me want to teach a whole class on class theory. But I think labor history can be a tricky one to teach to students. I feel like they all empathize with Emma Goldman and Eugene Debs, but then when you get up to the recent past or the contemporary period, a lot of the students' class biases come out.
Yeah.
So I think sort of grounding the history classes we teach in a little more exploration of theory might help get students to kind of rethink some of their own assumptions about class.
Yeah, theory can be a way to kind of take a distance from the things that seem intuitive or obvious from your experience.
Yeah, common sense knowledge. Get you to question that common sense knowledge that you've picked along the way.
Yes, at best, if you can make it through the jargon, which this book is remarkably free from.
I would just one more thing in closing before we close. It looks like we're wrapping up. Is that Jesse? You had mentioned the IAS, and I meant to include that in my opening thanks, but this book would not have been possible without the support of the IAS. And here you are again, providing this role to facilitate this conversation. The Institute for Anarchist Studies is celebrating its 25th anniversary, which in terms of thinking about movement institutions that have a longevity and continued commitment to social struggle, that's very rare and very impressive. And I think it's something that should be celebrated. Absolutely.
Indeed. Yeah, I feel very lucky to join the board this year. It's an amazing institution. Let's see, we have time maybe for one more question, if nobody from the audience has one. I was wondering actually what you make of the rise in recent years of I've been hearing a kind of return to the insistence on class first or class only approaches to organizing. Do you see this as basically kind of regressive then?
Seems like a mistake. I mean, I understand the impetus, which is that in the United States in particular, it's very difficult to talk about class in a meaningful way. And that class is sort of the, at least in mainstream discourse, the forgotten third of this triad around race, class, and gender that attracts a lot of attention. So the impetus to be like, hey, this is one part of this whole that we need to spend some time thinking on and emphasizing, I think is important. But I think where some of the missteps comes is in trying to, make unreconstructed materialist project happen again. And I think that project has some real shortcomings. There's been a whole history of activism and scholarship building on those insights, and we need to take that history seriously. We should be learning from that whole progression to think about where we find ourselves in the 21st century.
I think one of the really valuable functions of the book is to kind of serve as a chunk of collective memory. I love the way that it really begins with this discussion of from the ground up, these working class struggles and working class attempts at self-understanding. So
yeah.
This has been an amazing discussion and presentation. Thank you very, very much, Michael Reagan and Julie Greene. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks to you both. Yeah, thanks to the audience.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. This was really fun.
Yeah, great questions.